When I bought the house, I didn't even look twice at the basement. It was an impulse purchase, the kind of decision you regret when the excitement wears off. My realtor had called it quaint and full of charm, which in retrospect was code for in need of a lot of work. The basement had been an afterthought, just a cold, dimly lit space I planned to use for storage. But that was before the lights started flickering. At first, I didn't think much of it. A single bulb dangling from the ceiling, old wiring. It was bound to be unreliable. The light would dim and brighten erratically, sometimes going out completely. The electrician I called shrugged it off, saying it was probably just loose connections. He tightened a few wires, replaced the bulb, and left. For a while, it seemed fixed. Then came the tapping. It always started just as I was about to drift off to sleep. Faint, rhythmic, almost too soft to notice at first. I tried to tell myself it was the house settling, or maybe the old pipes rattling. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that. The sound was too deliberate, like someone lightly drumming their fingers against the concrete walls. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. Grabbing a flashlight, I made my way down to the basement. The single bulb overhead buzzed faintly, casting a pale yellow light that barely reached the corners of the room. I swept the flashlight beam across the walls and the floor, but everything was as it should be. Boxes stacked neatly, tools hanging on hooks, the water heater humming in the corner. That's when I noticed the footprint. It was faint, barely visible on the dusty floor near the far wall. A single, bare footprint. My chest tightened as I stared at it, my mind racing for a logical explanation. Maybe I had tracked dirt in from outside. Maybe it was older than I realized. I told myself anything but the obvious, that someone had been down here. I left the basement that night with a bad taste in my mouth, but no answers. The next day, I went about my routine, trying to put the incident out of my mind. It worked until the flickering light came back, worse than before. Now it wasn't just flickering, it was strobing, throwing erratic shadows across the room that seemed to dance on the walls. I decided to take a closer look at the far wall, the one where I'd found the footprint. Something about it didn't sit right with me. The paint was peeling in jagged strips, revealing what looked like metal? That didn't make sense. I scratched at the surface with my fingernail, then a screwdriver. Beneath the crumbling paint was a rusty, iron door embedded in the wall. It didn't have a handle. I stood there, staring at the iron door, my breath coming in shallow bursts. It was unlike anything I'd ever seen in a residential home. Who builds a basement door without a handle? And why was it hidden behind a layer of plaster and paint? I tried to pry it open, but the edges were sealed tight. Running my hands along the frame, I found a small circular hole where a lock might have been. It was too narrow for any modern key, and the edges were jagged, as if the mechanism had been ripped out long ago. For the first time in years, I felt the gnawing presence of fear. Not the jump scare kind of fear, but the deep, primal dread that seeps into your bones when something doesn't add up. That night, the tapping started again. This time, it was louder, sharper, and more insistent, like someone pounding on the other side of the door. I didn't sleep. The next morning, I called a contractor friend to take a look at the basement. I didn't mention the door, just said I wanted to renovate the space. When he arrived, I showed him around, casually directing him to the far wall. His reaction was immediate. "This isn't supposed to be here," he said, crouching down to inspect the frame. "It's reinforced. You don't see this in homes unless someone's trying to secure something." He paused, glancing up at me. "Or keep something in." His words settled like lead in my stomach. He suggested tearing the door out, but something in me resisted. What if we opened it and found something we couldn't unsee? I lied, saying I'd think about it, and he left, promising to call with an estimate. That night, everything escalated. The flickering light stopped flickering altogether. It went out completely, plunging the basement into darkness. I heard the tapping again, but this time it wasn't coming from the door. It was upstairs, in my kitchen. I froze in bed, straining to hear. The rhythmic tapping was joined by the sound of chairs scraping against the floor, then a low, guttural noise I couldn't place. It wasn't quite human, but it wasn't entirely inhuman either. Clutching my phone, I crept down the stairs. The kitchen was empty, but the back door was wide open, letting in the cool night air. A single muddy footprint marked the threshold, leading back down to the basement. I wanted to run, to leave the house and never look back, but some morbid curiosity, or stupidity, pushed me forward. I grabbed a kitchen knife and descended into the basement. The iron door was ajar. From the other side, I heard breathing. It was slow and heavy, like the labored breaths of someone who had been running. A deep chill settled over me as I approached, each step feeling heavier than the last. My flashlight beam wavered as I held it in trembling hands, aiming it into the darkness beyond the door. The space was narrow, a tunnel lined with brick and dirt that seemed to stretch endlessly into the distance. The breathing grew louder, closer, until a shadow moved in the beam of light. I didn't wait to see what it was. Dropping the flashlight, I bolted up the stairs, out of the house and into my car. I drove until the sun came up, until I couldn't feel the adrenaline in my veins anymore. I never went back. The house sold quickly, despite the stories I told the realtor to omit. I don't know what's behind that door, and I don't want to. But sometimes, late at night, I dream of the flickering light and wake to the sound of tapping. It started with the smell. For the first week after I moved into the old house, I chalked it up to mustiness. The property had been on the market for months, and the basement, like the rest of the house, had that stale air that comes from being shut up too long. But no matter how many dehumidifiers I ran or how much scrubbing I did, the smell never went away. If anything, it grew stronger, a cloying, metallic odor, like rust mixed with something sweet. I tried to ignore it, focusing on unpacking and fixing up the place. But every time I ventured into the basement, the smell seemed to cling to me, following me upstairs as if it had soaked into my skin. It wasn't until I decided to repaint the basement walls that I noticed the trunk. It was tucked into a corner, half hidden by stacks of old paint cans and a crumbling pile of bricks. The trunk was huge, big enough for me to lie down in, and made of heavy, dark wood reinforced with thick iron bands. Its surface was covered in scratches and dents, as if someone had tried, unsuccessfully, to break into it. A rusted padlock hung from the latch, and a thick chain was wrapped around the entire thing, secured with another, even older lock. The whole setup seemed bizarrely overkill, and I couldn't stop staring at it. I told myself I'd deal with it later. There were plenty of other things to worry about. The leaky sink, the creaky stairs, the peeling wallpaper in the dining room. But no matter what I did, I couldn't stop thinking about the trunk. The smell got worse after I found it. At night, when the house was still, I swore I could hear faint creaking sounds coming from the basement, like the groan of wood under strain. Once, I even thought I heard a muffled thump, but when I went downstairs to check, the trunk was exactly where I'd left it, silent and unmoving. Finally, curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed a crowbar and bolt cutters and went to work on the locks. The first one, the newer padlock, came off easily enough. But the chain was more stubborn, and I had to fight the urge to give up halfway through. It felt wrong somehow, like I was disturbing something that shouldn't be disturbed. When the last piece of the chain clattered to the floor, I hesitated. My heart was racing, and my hands were slick with sweat. The trunk was just a box, I told myself. A really old, really creepy box, but still just a box. I gripped the edge of the lid and heaved it open. The smell hit me like a physical blow. It was so strong, so foul, that I staggered back, gagging. I could barely see through the tears streaming down my face, but what I saw inside made my blood turn to ice. The trunk was empty, almost. Lying in the center, curled into a fetal position, was what looked like a doll. Its surface was mottled and cracked, like it had been carved from wood or molded from clay, and its eyes were two glinting black stones that seemed to glimmer in the dim light. The longer I stared at it, the more I realized it wasn't a doll at all. It was a mummified corpse. I stumbled back, knocking over a paint can as I scrambled for the stairs. My breath came in short, ragged gasps, and my mind raced, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. It wasn't possible. Things like this didn't happen in real life. A body in a trunk? In my house? I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw its cracked, leathery skin, the glint of its dark, unblinking eyes. I thought about calling the police, but fear kept my hands off the phone. What if they thought I'd put it there? The house was mine now. No one would believe I didn't know about the trunk. The next morning, I went down to the basement again, armed with my phone and a crowbar. I'd take a picture, I told myself. Document the proof, just in case I needed it. But when I reached the trunk, the lid was closed. I hadn't closed it. My heart thudded painfully in my chest as I stepped closer. The chain and locks were still lying on the floor where I'd left them. There was no sign that anyone else had been in the house, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. With trembling hands, I opened the lid. The smell was just as overpowering as before, but the figure inside was different. It wasn't curled up anymore. Now it lay flat on its back, its head tilted slightly to the side as if it were staring at me. I couldn't bring myself to touch it. I slammed the lid shut and ran upstairs, locking the basement door behind me. I told myself I'd call someone, anyone, later. For now, I just needed to get out of the house. That night, I stayed at a hotel. I tried to convince myself that I was overreacting, that my imagination was running wild. But when I returned the next morning, my fears were confirmed. The basement door was wide open. I crept down the stairs, gripping a kitchen knife like it would do any good. The trunk was still there, but the lid was ajar, and the figure inside was gone. Panic set in as I searched the basement, then the rest of the house. Every room was empty, but the air felt heavy, oppressive, like the walls were closing in on me. When I went back to the basement, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. Scratch marks on the inside of the trunk's lid, deep grooves that hadn't been there the day before. I called the police that afternoon. I told them about the trunk, about the smell, about the figure I'd found inside. They seemed skeptical, but when they saw the scratch marks and the chains on the floor, their demeanor changed. They asked me to leave while they investigated, and I didn't argue. 2 days later, I got a call from the detective assigned to the case. "There's no body," he said, his voice curt. "Nothing in the trunk but some old rags. Are you sure you didn't imagine it?" I wanted to argue, to insist that I wasn't crazy, but something stopped me. Maybe it was the tone in his voice, or maybe it was the feeling that crept over me as I sat in my empty hotel room, a feeling like I was being watched. I sold the house the next month. I don't know what happened to the trunk or the thing that was inside it, and I don't want to know. But sometimes, late at night, I wake up to the faint sound of creaking wood and wonder if it found a new home. When my sister and I inherited our grandmother's house, we thought it would be a simple matter of cleaning up and putting it on the market. It was an old, creaky Victorian place with appealing exterior and an overgrown yard, but the location was great, and the house had character, a euphemism realtors use for a lot of work needed. The first time we walked through it after her passing, it felt off. Not eerie, just unusually quiet. The air was thick and heavy, carrying the faint scent of lavender, my grandmother's favorite perfume. My sister, Kate, chalked it up to nostalgia, but I couldn't shake the sense that something lingered in the corners, just out of sight. We didn't even know the house had a basement at first. The door was hidden behind a cabinet in the kitchen pantry, the kind of thing you wouldn't notice unless you were looking for it. Kate discovered it by accident while clearing out the pantry shelves. "Hey," she called, knocking on the wood paneling. "There's something back here." We pried the cabinet loose and found the door. It was narrow and wooden, with rusted hinges and a small iron latch. The air that seeped out when we opened it was colder, damp, and carried a strange, earthy smell. A steep staircase descended into darkness. "Creepy," Kate muttered, shining her flashlight down the stairs. How did we not know about this? The basement was larger than we expected. A maze of low ceilings and uneven concrete floors. Old furniture and boxes were stacked haphazardly against the walls, along with jars of preserves that had long since spoiled. But it was the far corner of the room that drew our attention. The floorboards were newer there, their clean wood stark against the cracked, stained concrete. Something about the way they gleamed in the light made my stomach churn. "What do you think's under there?" Kate asked, her voice tinged with morbid curiosity. "Nothing good," I replied, half joking. But the look she gave me made it clear she wanted to find out. We didn't have the tools to pry up the boards that day, so we agreed to leave it alone for now. That night, I dreamed of whispers, faint, indecipherable voices that seemed to come from beneath me, growing louder and more frantic until I woke up in a cold sweat. The next day, I told Kate about the dream. She laughed it off, calling me dramatic. But when we went back to the house, she admitted she'd had trouble sleeping too. "Probably just the stress," she said. "This whole place is like a bad horror movie set." We spent the day cleaning out the basement, carefully avoiding the newer floorboards. But as the hours passed, I noticed something strange. The air down there felt alive. The faintest rustling noises, like fabric brushing against wood, seemed to follow us. At first, I thought it was mice or the wind, but the sounds were too rhythmic, too deliberate. And then, as I was stacking a box of old dishes near the corner, I heard it. A whisper, soft and slow, just a single word that sounded like my name. I froze, the box nearly slipping from my hands. My ears strained against the silence that followed, and for a moment, I convinced myself I'd imagined it. But then I heard it again. My name, drawn out in a rasping, eerie voice. "Kate," I called, my voice trembling. "What?" she replied from across the room. I glanced in her direction. She was organizing a pile of photo albums, oblivious. "Did you say my name?" She frowned. "No. Why?" I didn't answer, too focused on the corner. The whispering stopped, but I couldn't shake the sensation of being watched. Something about the way the air felt over there, the way the shadows pooled around the newer boards, made me want to leave and never come back. "Let's call it a day," I said, more forcefully than I'd intended. Kate gave me a look but didn't argue. As we climbed the stairs, I resisted the urge to look back, feeling as though the darkness was pressing in behind us, eager to follow. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard faint whispers, too soft to understand but constant enough to keep me on edge. I finally fell into a restless sleep just before dawn, only to be jolted awake by the sound of pounding at my bedroom door. It was Kate. Her face was pale, her eyes wide. "I heard it," she whispered, clutching the door frame. "Heard what?" I asked, though I already knew. She shook her head, her voice trembling. "The whispers. It was in my room. I swear to God. I thought someone was standing at the foot of my bed." We spent the rest of the night in the living room with every light in the house on. When morning came, we returned to the basement, armed with crowbars and flashlights. I didn't want to know what was under those boards, but Kate was insistent. "We have to," she said. "What if it's, I don't know, something important? Or something we're better off not knowing," I muttered. But she was already prying up the first board. It came loose with a groan, revealing a hollow space beneath. The smell hit us immediately, wet, decayed wood mixed with something sour and metallic. As we removed more boards, the smell grew stronger, until we finally uncovered what was hidden beneath. It was a hole, a deep, dark pit, its sides lined with bricks that had long since crumbled. At the bottom, half buried in dirt, was a tangle of bones. Human bones. Kate stumbled back, gagging, and I stared down into the pit, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. A skull grinned up at me, its hollow eye sockets fixed on something far away. Beside it was a smaller set of bones, and I realized with horror that we weren't looking at just one body. We were looking at two. We called the police, of course. They arrived within the hour, sealing off the basement and treating the house like a crime scene. The remains were old, they said, likely decades or even a century. But when we mentioned the whispers, the officer taking our statements exchanged a look with his partner. "You're not the first," he said quietly. "People who lived here before you said the same thing. Always thought they were just hearing things." We sold the house as soon as the investigation was over, but the whispers didn't stop. Even in my new apartment, I sometimes wake up at night with the feeling that something is in the room with me. And on bad nights, when the air is still and the shadows are long, I swear I can hear my name being called. The rental was supposed to be temporary. A cheap little house just outside the city where I could crash while figuring out my next steps after a messy breakup. It wasn't perfect. Creaky floors, drafty windows, and a lingering smell of dampness no matter how many candles I lit. But it was cheap, and the landlord was in no rush to sell, which worked for me. The basement, though, that was the part of the house I avoided. From the moment I moved in, I hated it. The door leading downstairs was in the kitchen, and every time I passed it, I felt an unexplainable unease. I told myself it was just my imagination. The way old houses always seemed creepier than they really were. Still, I didn't go down there if I could help it. The landlord had assured me the basement was dry and mostly empty, but I had no reason to go poking around. About a month in, things started to feel off. It was little stuff at first. The odd creak of a floorboard when I wasn't walking, lights flickering even though the wiring had been checked, and that distinct sense of being watched. I brushed it off. I was alone in a strange house. Of course my mind was playing tricks on me. But then the door appeared. I noticed it one evening while cooking dinner. The basement door was ajar, a little strange, since I always kept it closed. But what caught my attention was the door inside the basement. I could see it from where I stood, a faint outline in the dim light at the bottom of the stairs. Except there hadn't been a second door when I moved in. I was sure of it. Curiosity won out over fear, and I descended the stairs, my footsteps echoing on the unfinished wood. The basement was just as I remembered. Bare concrete walls, a few scattered boxes, and the old water heater humming in the corner. But now, on the far wall, there was a door. It was simple, wooden, and unpainted, with a rusted iron handle. No frame, no hinges, just a door that looked as though it had been crudely cut into the concrete. My stomach churned as I approached it, every instinct screaming at me to turn back. But I didn't. I reached out and pulled. The door wouldn't budge. It didn't even rattle in its frame. It was as if it were fused to the wall. Frustrated, I tried one last yank before giving up and retreating upstairs. That night, I dreamed about it. The door was open, a faint light spilling out into the basement. In the dream, I could hear whispers, soft, insistent voices calling my name. I woke in a cold sweat, the sound of my own breath harsh in the silent room. The next day, I decided to ignore the door altogether. It wasn't worth the stress, but as the week went on, things got worse. At night, I'd hear faint knocking sounds coming from below, so subtle I could almost convince myself I was imagining them. The smell of dampness grew stronger, tinged with something metallic. And then, one night, I found the basement door wide open. I stood frozen in the kitchen, staring at the open basement door. The light at the bottom of the stairs flickered, casting long, uneven shadows. My heart pounded as I stepped closer, my hand gripping the flashlight I'd grabbed from the counter. "Hello?" I called, my voice trembling. There was no answer, only the faint hum of the water heater and the distant sound of dripping water. I descended the stairs, each creak of the steps magnified in the silence. The second door was still there, solid and unmoving against the concrete wall. But something was different. The faint scratches I'd noticed on its surface the first time were deeper now, as if something had been clawing at it from the other side. I don't know why I touched the handle. Curiosity, defiance, or maybe just plain stupidity. But the moment my fingers brushed the cold iron, the basement lights went out. Panic surged through me. I fumbled with the flashlight, clicking it on just as I heard the sound, the deep, guttural groan of wood bending under pressure. I turned the light toward the door and froze. The handle was turning. I stumbled back, tripping over a box and nearly dropping the flashlight. My breathing was ragged, my chest tight. The handle twisted once more, then stopped. The silence that followed was unbearable, as though the entire basement was holding its breath. And then, the whispering started. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible, but it grew louder with each passing second. Dozens of voices, overlapping and insistent, their words unintelligible but filled with urgency. I scrambled to my feet and bolted up the stairs, slamming the basement door shut and locking it. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the couch with every light in the house on, clutching my phone like a lifeline. At some point, exhaustion must have taken over, because I woke to the sound of knocking. It was coming from the basement. I called the landlord the next morning, demanding answers. He sounded confused when I mentioned the second door. "There's no door down there," he insisted. "It's just a storage space." I told him to come see for himself. When he arrived, I led him to the basement, bracing myself for his reaction. But when we reached the bottom of the stairs, the door was gone. "What's this about?" he asked, his tone edged with impatience. I tried to explain, but the words felt hollow even as I said them. I could see the disbelief in his eyes, the way he looked at me like I was unhinged. I spent the next few days researching the house, desperate to find some explanation. What I found made my blood run cold. Decades ago, a family had lived there, a husband, wife, and their young daughter. The girl had disappeared, and though her parents were suspected of foul play, no evidence was ever found. The case remained unsolved. I left the house that same week, breaking my lease and moving in with a friend. I don't care about the deposit I forfeited or the angry calls from the landlord. All I care about is that I'm far away from that basement, from the door that wasn't there. But sometimes, late at night, I hear faint whispers through the vents, and every so often, I dream of a hand on the other side of a door, waiting to turn the handle. I didn't know much about the house when I rented it. The landlord was eager to get someone in, offering me a reduced rate if I agreed to a year-long lease. It wasn't perfect, a bit old, with a basement that smelled faintly of mildew, but it was spacious, quiet, and close to work. I signed the papers the same day I toured it. It wasn't until I started unpacking that I noticed the hole. The basement was mostly bare, just concrete walls, a few wooden beams, and an ancient washer and dryer. But one section of the wall looked strange, like someone had started to dig through the concrete and then stopped. The hole was about the size of a basketball, its edges jagged and uneven. From the angle of the light, I could see that it extended back into the wall, disappearing into darkness. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe it was from old construction work or some previous owner's failed DIY project. But as the weeks went on, I started noticing things. Small things at first. A cold draft near the hole. The way sound seemed to echo strangely in the basement. And then there was the scratching. It always started at night, faint at first, like nails on wood. At first, I thought it was mice or some other pest, so I called an exterminator. He came the next day, poking around the basement and peering into the hole with a flashlight. "Doesn't look like there's anything in there," he said. "Might just be the house settling. These old places make all kinds of noises." I wanted to believe him, but the sounds continued, growing louder and more insistent. Sometimes, I'd hear them from my bedroom, faint but unmistakable. It wasn't just scratching anymore. There was a shuffling sound too, like something moving around. One night, I decided to investigate. Armed with a flashlight and a long stick, I descended into the basement, every creak of the stairs sending a shiver down my spine. The hole gaped like a black wound in the wall, and as I got closer, the air grew colder, carrying a faint, sour smell. I shone the flashlight into the hole. The beam illuminated rough stone walls, dirt, and what looked like claw marks. The realization made my stomach churn. The scratches were deep, like something had been trying to dig its way out. Before I could examine further, the light flickered. The batteries, fresh that morning, died without warning, plunging me into darkness. And then I heard it, a low, rasping breath. It was coming from the hole. I froze, gripping the flashlight like a weapon. The breath was slow and labored, rising and falling in a rhythm that made my skin crawl. Every nerve in my body screamed at me to run, but my legs felt rooted to the floor. Then came the sound, something dragging against the stone, a slow, deliberate scrape that echoed in the confined space. It grew louder, closer, as if whatever was in the hole was shifting, moving toward the opening. I bolted, scrambling up the basement stairs. I slammed the door shut and shoved the heaviest chair I could find against it. My heart hammered in my chest as I sat there, staring at the door, waiting for something. But the house was silent. The next day, I tried to convince myself it had been my imagination. Maybe the old house was playing tricks on me, or maybe I'd let the exterminator's settling house explanation get into my head. But deep down, I knew better. I decided to seal the hole. I didn't care if it was pests or something else. I wanted it gone. I bought concrete mix, gloves, and a trowel, determined to put an end to whatever was happening in that basement. That evening, I dragged my supplies downstairs, avoiding the hole until the last possible moment. When I finally approached it, I froze. Something was different. The hole was bigger. It was subtle, only an inch or two, but unmistakable. The edges looked freshly disturbed, and the sour smell was stronger, almost nauseating. As I stood there, the room grew colder, and I felt an undeniable pressure in the air, as though I wasn't alone. Still, I forced myself to work. I poured the concrete into the hole, packing it tightly, layer by layer. The sound of the trowel scraping against stone was oddly comforting, drowning out the oppressive silence. By the time I was done, the hole was completely sealed. I cleaned up quickly and fled upstairs, refusing to look back. That night, I slept more soundly than I had in weeks. But the relief didn't last. The next morning, I woke to a loud crash. Groggy and disoriented, I stumbled into the kitchen, where I found the basement door hanging open. The chair I'd wedged against it was on the floor, its legs splintered. My blood ran cold as I stared down the dark staircase. The hole was back. Not just back, it was bigger than before. The fresh concrete I'd poured scattered in chunks across the basement floor. The smell was overwhelming, a putrid stench that made my eyes water. And then I saw it. A hand. It was pale and gaunt, the fingers long and clawed, with skin stretched so tightly over bone that it looked like it might tear. The hand gripped the edge of the hole, pulling itself forward inch by agonizing inch. I didn't wait to see the rest. I ran from the house, not even stopping to grab my keys. I called the police from a neighbor's phone, my voice shaking as I tried to explain what I'd seen. When they arrived, they found nothing. No hole, no debris, no sign that anything was out of the ordinary. They looked at me like I was crazy, and maybe I was, but I didn't go back. I paid the landlord the remainder of the lease, packed what I could in a single trip, and left town. Sometimes, late at night, I dream about that hand. I dream about what might have crawled out of that hole if I'd stayed just a little longer. And when I wake, there's always that faint, sour smell lingering in the air.